On the morning of June 14th, 1998, the Miller family packed their station wagon for what was supposed to be a simple summer getaway. Daniel and Karen Miller, both in their late 30s, were taking their two children, 10-year-old Emily and 7-year-old Josh, on a road trip from their small town in northern Indiana to visit relatives across state lines in Missouri. Neighbors remembered how excited the kids were, the backseat piled with coloring books, snacks, and cassette tapes for the long drive. It wasn't a dramatic departure, just a family leaving home with plans to return a week later. Nothing about that morning suggested that they would never come back. The first day unfolded predictably. They were seen at a gas station just outside of town, where Daniel paid in cash and Karen picked up bottled water and a bag of chips. A few hours later, a waitress at a roadside diner west of Springfield remembered them stopping for lunch. The children split a grilled cheese sandwich and a slice of pie, while Daniel chatted briefly with the staff about the weather. There was no sign of distress, no unusual company around them. At that point, the Millers were simply another family traveling through a corridor of America's backroads. By mid-afternoon, they were back on the road, heading toward a stretch of highway bordered by dense forest, a part of the drive known for its long, unbroken miles and steep wooded ravines. By evening, all contact stopped. Relatives in Missouri expected a phone call to confirm their arrival, but the hours slipped into night without word. At first, no one panicked. Delays were common on summer road trips, but when the sun came up the next morning and there was still no sign of the family, calls began flooding between relatives. By that evening, Daniel's brother filed a missing persons report, explaining that it wasn't like them to vanish without checking in. Local police took the report seriously, and by the following day, patrol cars were scanning the highway, looking for any sign of the Miller station wagon. The early searches focused on the obvious. Officers checked motels and truck stops along their intended route. They called nearby hospitals in case there had been an accident. Roadside crews confirmed no wreckage had been reported. Flyers went up at gas stations, with the family's smiling photographs printed in black and white. Missing, last seen June 14th. Within 48 hours, the Miller disappearance had become front-page news in their hometown, described as a mystery that defied logic. But as investigators retraced their steps, frustration set in. The gas station clerk remembered them clearly. The waitress at the diner provided the last verified sighting, noting the car's license plate number. Beyond that, there was nothing. No financial transactions, no toll records, no eyewitnesses along the highway stretch they were believed to have taken. The road they disappeared on wasn't a major interstate. It was quieter, shadowed by thick forest on both sides, with only scattered pull-offs. For searchers, that meant miles of wilderness that could easily conceal a vehicle or anything worse. When days turned into weeks, the case drew in state police and even volunteer groups who combed through wooded areas, rivers, and ravines with dogs and helicopters. Yet every lead ended in silence. The forest canopy was too dense for aerial searches to penetrate deeply. Ground teams struggled with uneven terrain, steep cliffs, and heavy summer undergrowth. They found abandoned cars in the woods before, relics of theft or neglect, but nothing tied to the Millers. Each empty ravine, each unmarked trail brought only more disappointment. The public followed closely. Rumors spread quickly in town, whispers of foul play, of the family running from debt, of something darker happening along that isolated road. But for every theory, there was no evidence. All that remained were 4 people who had simply vanished. The longer the investigation dragged on without progress, the more the weight fell on relatives, who were forced to face the possibility that they might never know what happened. By the end of that summer, the search was scaled back. What began as an urgent, around-the-clock effort settled into a cold reality. There were no suspects, no crime scene, no trace of where a family of 4 had gone. Officers involved later admitted that this was the kind of case that haunted them, because the lack of evidence meant there was nothing to hold on to, no closure for themselves or for the family left behind. In the community, the unanswered questions became part of daily life. Parents warned their children about the dangers of traveling those roads. Truckers spoke of stretches of highway where you could drive for miles without passing another vehicle, where the forest pressed so close it felt suffocating. And always the question lingered: how could an entire family, car and all, vanish into thin air? As the first-year anniversary approached with no developments, the Miller case was no longer just another missing persons report. It was an open wound for a small town and a mystery that seemed frozen in time. And for investigators, it marked only the beginning of a decades-long silence that no one was prepared to endure. The first days after the Millers vanished were marked by urgency and restless motion. Police mapped out their likely route, marking every small town and gas stop between Indiana and Missouri. Officers retraced the confirmed sightings, starting with the gas station outside of town and then the roadside diner west of Springfield. The waitress who had served them remembered the car clearly, its dull green paint and the way the children had argued over pie. But after that meal, the trail ended. Not a single person could say with certainty that they had seen the Millers again. Patrol cars began moving along the highways in both directions, stopping at motels, rest stops, and campgrounds. Desk clerks were shown photographs of the family, asked if they had checked in or paid in cash. Truckers who traveled the corridor were stopped and questioned. Some thought they remembered seeing the wagon at night, its headlights disappearing down a side road, but none of the accounts could be confirmed. For investigators, the lack of solid sightings after the diner made the case unnerving. It meant the family had simply vanished within a window of a few hours. Search parties soon expanded. Deputies, volunteers, and relatives walked the shoulders of the highways looking for broken glass, tire marks, or anything that might suggest a crash. Helicopters scanned the roads and rivers, their spotlights sweeping through tree lines and cliff edges. Divers were even sent into nearby waterways, fearing the possibility that the car had slid off a wet road. But the rivers carried no secrets, and the steep ravines revealed only brush and stone. The forest seemed to absorb their efforts, providing no answers. As days stretched into a week, investigators began turning to less obvious places. They searched barns and abandoned farmhouses near the highway, suspecting foul play. Rural properties were combed over, and landowners were questioned about strange vehicles or noises at night. Some families admitted to hearing the sound of an engine late on June 14th, but none had seen where it went. The silence left investigators uneasy. Each barn door swung open to reveal nothing more than dust and animals, each empty room a dead end. Theories soon began circulating within the investigative team. One possibility was a simple accident, that Daniel had lost control and gone off the road into an area too remote to spot. Another was foul play, that someone had flagged the Millers down, pretending to need help, and ambushed them. A third possibility carried its own disturbing implications. Had the family chosen to vanish, walking away from their lives on purpose? For the relatives, that idea felt like a betrayal. They insisted Daniel and Karen were stable, rooted, and loving parents. There was no sign they would abandon everything. But for detectives, all three explanations remained on the table. The community's emotions were raw. Volunteers scoured the wooded backroads, some on horseback, others with dogs trained to track scent. But even the animals seemed to lose the trail past the diner, as if the family had driven into a place that refused to be found. The more the forest swallowed their efforts, the more the case took on a weight of impossibility. Search leaders admitted privately that the terrain was too vast. You could walk 100 yards off the road and be invisible to anyone searching above. Meanwhile, local police set up checkpoints on nearby highways, looking for the green station wagon. Cars were stopped and plates checked, but the Miller vehicle never appeared. Investigators dug into Daniel and Karen's financial history, checking for large withdrawals or sudden debts. Nothing unusual surfaced. Their credit cards remained untouched, their bank accounts dormant. There was no ransom demand, no strange phone calls, no indication that anyone wanted them harmed. The more time passed, the more the investigation shifted from methodical search to grasping at possibilities. One lead involved a report of a green car matching theirs near a rest stop, but security footage was too grainy to confirm. Another came from a truck driver who swore he'd seen a station wagon swerve suddenly and vanish down an unmarked road, but his account was vague and conflicting. Detectives drove out to the spot he mentioned, searching dirt paths and logging trails, but the results were the same. Nothing. The family's disappearance began to feel like a puzzle missing its central piece. Investigators couldn't understand how a car could disappear so completely along a route that, while rural, was still traveled daily by truckers and vacationers. For relatives, the silence was agonizing. Every phone call from the police was both a lifeline and a source of dread, because the news was always the same: no evidence, no trace, no answers. After 2 weeks, the initial search lost momentum, resources dwindled, volunteers had to return to work, and state police began scaling back. What remained was a community still haunted by the absence of 4 people who had driven into the forest and never come out. Theories multiplied. Some insisted they had been targeted, others clung to the idea of an accident. But without a scene, without a body, nothing could be confirmed. The highway itself grew infamous. Travelers spoke of it in hushed tones, parents warning children not to accept rides or stop for strangers. For investigators, the case file thickened with false leads, but the truth stayed hidden. And as the official search began to stall, whispers started spreading that this was no ordinary disappearance, that something darker had happened along that forgotten stretch of road, and the forest itself was keeping the secret. With the official search grinding to a halt, the silence left behind was heavy and unsettling. The absence of answers created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured rumors. In the Millers' small hometown, where every face was familiar and news traveled quickly, conversations shifted from quiet hope to restless speculation. At first, neighbors spoke in hushed tones about possible accidents or wrong turns, but as days stretched into weeks, darker theories began to take root. Some suggested that Daniel might have been carrying debts he never spoke of, obligations that had grown so unbearable they pushed him to take his family and vanish. Others whispered about the possibility of marital strain, pointing to the ordinary stress of raising 2 children, the relentless weight of bills, and the quiet tensions that can build inside a household. 2. Friends who had shared dinners with the Millers, these rumors felt cruel and unfair. Yet in the absence of facts, speculation grew louder than truth, spreading through the town like wildfire. The wider community began to weave darker narratives. The highway where the Millers were last seen was notorious among locals for its long stretches of emptiness, the kind of road where hitchhikers were a common sight. People wondered if the family had pulled over to help someone and been ambushed. Police considered it seriously, digging into known offenders who drifted through the area. A few names emerged: drifters with histories of assault, truckers with violent pasts, but none could be tied to the Millers with evidence. Each time a lead appeared, it seemed to crumble under the smallest bit of scrutiny. Conspiracy theories soon followed. Some insisted the family's disappearance was staged. They pointed to how suddenly they had vanished, how perfectly clean the trail had gone cold. There were no tire marks, no calls, no remains. It was, some argued, too neat, as if the family had deliberately erased themselves. These theories gained traction in coffee shops and town meetings, with people insisting they'd heard rumors of secret plans or arguments in the weeks before the trip. But investigators who dug into the Millers' bank records, school reports, and social ties found nothing to support the claim. Their accounts were untouched, their house undisturbed, their children's toys still scattered across the living room floor. There were also theories of a serial predator, a hidden figure hunting travelers along that corridor. The FBI had, at the time, been tracking cases of disappearances tied to interstate highways. Some investigators briefly considered whether the Millers had become victims of a wider pattern. But when agents cross-checked the timeline and the location, they found no overlapping suspect who matched the circumstances. There were no reports of other families vanishing in the same manner, and the case couldn't be linked to the serial offenders already under investigation. For a moment, hope had risen that maybe the answer lay in a broader web, but that too dissolved into disappointment. Interviews with relatives revealed small cracks that outsiders magnified. Karen's sister admitted that the couple had fought from time to time, sometimes bitterly. Daniel's coworker mentioned that he had been stressed about finances before the trip. These admissions were seized on by those desperate to construct a narrative, yet investigators knew they were fragments of ordinary life. Every family carried moments of tension, and nothing pointed toward the kind of despair that would explain vanishing without a word. Still, the whispers added weight to the mystery, painting the Millers not as victims of circumstance, but as possible architects of their own fate. In the background, grief deepened. The Miller grandparents clung to the hope that Emily and Josh were still alive somewhere, that maybe the family had run from something and would return when it was safe. Friends, however, began to confront the harder truth that the odds of survival after so many weeks in silence were slim. Every rumor, every unproven theory, reopened wounds for those closest to the family. They lived in a cycle of renewed hope and crushing collapse, each time police investigated a tip and came back with nothing. By late summer, the case had shifted from being an urgent search to a community obsession. Newspaper articles speculated openly about the possibility of foul play. Amateur sleuths wrote letters to the editor, detailing their own theories about where the car might have gone. Some believed the family had been forced off the road and into the woods. Others swore they had been abducted at a rest stop. And always, behind the speculation, was the same void of evidence. The sheriff at the time admitted in a press briefing that they were dealing with a ghost case, one where not a single shred of physical proof had surfaced since the last diner sighting. The rumors took a toll on the investigation itself. Police found themselves chasing ghosts, interviewing suspects who had no connection, driving out to remote barns on tips that turned up empty. With every false lead, credibility waned. The families waiting for answers began to feel abandoned, wondering if the investigation had already slipped beyond recovery. But even as official momentum faded, the stories did not stop. They lingered in town for years, attaching themselves to the Miller name, distorting memory, and turning grief into a permanent kind of suspicion. What remained most haunting for investigators was how every theory, no matter how elaborate or convincing, eventually collapsed when weighed against the absence of hard fact. No predator, no debts, no staged escape could be proven. All that was left was silence, a silence that seemed to stretch across decades, and it was in that silence that the case began to wither, suspended between rumor and truth, with the real answer buried somewhere no one had thought to look. As the years moved into the early 2000s, the Miller case settled into the background of life. The urgency that had once driven nightly news segments and packed community meetings gave way to a quieter, more enduring form of grief. Their relatives aged with the absence, holding on to photographs and birthdays that no longer had anyone to celebrate. Every holiday carried an empty chair. For Karen's parents, time did not soften the wound. It hardened it, calcifying into a permanent question that no one could answer. The police files gathered dust. Local authorities admitted privately that there were no new leads to chase. Occasionally, the case would be pulled back into the spotlight when a new officer joined the department or when a family member pushed for a review. In 2004, the FBI briefly examined it as part of a wider study into highway-related disappearances. Dozens of cases across the Midwest were compared, hunting for patterns of abduction or serial offenders. For a short time, hope stirred that the Miller disappearance might finally make sense within a larger puzzle. But when the comparisons were done, their case did not fit. It was too self-contained, too devoid of evidence, too unlike the others. Over the next decade, small sparks of hope would flare, only to be extinguished. Hikers stumbled on rusted car parts in the woods near the state border, and for weeks rumors swelled that the Miller vehicle had been located. Investigators hauled out the wreckage, only to determine it belonged to a different accident decades earlier. In another case, a license plate found deep in a creek bed appeared at first glance to match theirs, but corrosion obscured the numbers. When cleaned, the the plate turned out to belong to an unrelated missing vehicle. Each time, the disappointment was brutal, reopening wounds for the family and reminding them how little progress had been made. For the Miller children's cousins who had grown up waiting for answers, the mystery became part of their identity. Some recalled staying awake at night, imagining where Emily and Josh might be, if they were still alive somewhere. Others described the frustration of growing older while the missing children remained frozen in time, their school portraits never aging, their lives cut short but never confirmed. The silence left their relatives suspended, unable to grieve fully, unable to move forward. By the 2010s, the story was no longer front-page news, but it was never forgotten. True crime forums and amateur investigators picked up the case, trading theories and mapping the family's final known route. Strangers from hundreds of miles away debated the likelihood of abduction versus accident. Some argued that the dense forests had hidden their vehicle. Others claimed the clean disappearance suggested human involvement. But for all the digital chatter, no one could provide what the official investigation lacked: evidence. For detectives who had once worked the case, the Miller disappearance lingered in memory as a failure. Several admitted in later interviews that it was one of the few files that haunted them, because there had been nothing to hold on to. No bodies, no crime scene, no answers. It was a story that never closed, stretching across decades in a vacuum of silence. Every few years, the department would receive a tip from a hunter, a farmer, or someone convinced they had spotted something suspicious in the woods. Each one was logged, checked, and dismissed. The case remained frozen in place. The weight of uncertainty took its toll on the family. Daniel's brother passed away in 2012, never knowing what had happened to his sibling. Karen's parents died within a few years of each other, their final days marked by the absence of closure. Their obituaries carried the unspoken shadow of 4 names never laid to rest. For the younger generation, the story became a kind of inherited grief, a mystery passed down without resolution. By the mid-2000s, the forested corridor where the family vanished had changed. Roads had been repaved, signage updated, and technology improved. Yet, beneath the surface, the same dense ravines and hidden trails remained, untouched and unsearched since the late 1990s. Locals spoke less of the Millers now, but the older residents still remembered the summer of their disappearance. To them, it was proof that even in an age of satellites and cell phones, people could vanish completely. And so, the decades slipped by with only silence as their companion. The family was not declared dead, not found alive, and not connected to any known predator. They simply remained missing, trapped in a void where every theory collapsed and every lead dissolved. What had once been a case full of urgency hardened into a quiet, painful uncertainty that seemed permanent. But the land where they vanished had not forgotten. Beneath layers of earth and forest, the truth remained, waiting for the day when time itself would shift, and the secret would finally be forced back into the open. By the mid-2000s, nearly 2 decades had passed since the Millers disappeared, and the forest along their last known route had grown thicker and more unforgiving. What had once been familiar stretches of highway became lined with taller, denser trees. Side roads that had been gravel paths in the 90s were now overgrown, reclaimed by brush and creeping vines. Hunters who ventured into the backcountry spoke of ravines so steep and tangled that even a determined search team would have struggled to reach them. Over the years, the wilderness had sealed its own secrets, making the possibility of ever finding the Millers seem even more remote. Locals who spent time in those woods began to share uneasy stories. Some described hearing strange noises deep in the ravines, metallic groans that echoed at night, as if something buried far below was shifting with the earth. Others claimed to have stumbled upon wreckage in the undergrowth, only to find it too rusted and scattered to match the missing station wagon. In each case, rumors spread faster than facts. For a community haunted by 2 decades of silence, every sound, every twisted fragment of metal became a reminder of the family swallowed by the road. Superstition began to cling to the place. The stretch of highway where the Millers vanished was avoided at night, with drivers preferring longer routes to keep from passing through. Parents told their children stories of the forest that took people, as though the disappearance had marked the land with a kind of curse. While police had long since accepted that the case was cold, residents carried the weight of it as folklore, a story that blurred the line between fact and myth. The Millers were no longer just a family who had disappeared. They had become a cautionary tale about the wilderness and its ability to consume without leaving a trace. Hunters in particular spoke of areas too dense for even dogs to track. One described a gully so steep it seemed impossible to descend, filled with brush that tangled around the legs. Another recalled stumbling on a cluster of abandoned vehicles, stripped of plates and rusted into the ground, hidden away from the world. To them, the thought of the Miller station wagon lying in a similar place was not only possible, it was likely. But without clear evidence, these stories remained little more than whispers, told around campfires or in bars at the edge of town. For those closest to the family, hearing the disappearance reduced to folklore was painful. Karen's surviving relatives hated the way the story had shifted from tragedy to legend. They had wanted answers, not myths. But with every passing year, the case slipped further from the realm of investigation and deeper into local storytelling. Outsiders would come through town and hear the tale of the family who drove into the forest and never came out, and they would treat it as though it were something ghostly, not a real and devastating loss. Yet, despite the growing sense of permanence, there was still an undercurrent of unease. The fact that no one had ever found the car, the bodies, or even a scrap of clothing meant the story refused to fade entirely into the past. Even as the forest expanded, suspicion lingered that somewhere within its depths, the truth was still waiting. Some people were convinced the land itself had hidden the family deliberately, burying them in places human eyes would never find. Others argued that human hands must have played a role, that a predator had used the forest as cover to erase them. The inability to separate the rational from the imagined only deepened the case's grip on memory. The Millers became part of a collection of regional mysteries: hunters gone missing, hikers never returning from weekend trips, drivers whose cars had been found abandoned near logging trails. Whenever another disappearance occurred, people whispered about the Millers. They were seen not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a broader pattern of the land taking what it wanted. It was easier for some to believe in the power of the wilderness than to face the emptiness of not knowing. By then, nearly everyone who had once searched for the family had moved on or retired. The case file sat untouched, thick with old reports and dead leads. Yet, on nights when storms rattled the woods and winds roared through the ravines, locals swore the land itself seemed to speak. Metallic echoes, broken branches, shapes glimpsed in shadows, always interpreted as reminders of the Millers. The silence of the case had transformed into a presence, one that hovered over the town like a permanent weight. And so, the forest reclaimed not only the land, but also the story itself. It became less a crime to be solved and more a legend to be endured. But the truth, buried under decades of growth and silence, was still there, waiting for an event violent enough, unexpected enough, to finally disturb it. In the summer of 2025, the region was struck by one of the most violent storms it had seen in years. For 3 days, torrential rains battered the backroads and forests, turning rivers into raging torrents and carving deep scars into the earth. Power lines fell, old bridges weakened, and entire sections of hillside gave way under the weight of the water. Locals described the storm as one that reshaped the land itself, tearing away the familiar and leaving behind a terrain that felt raw and exposed. For most, it was an inconvenience, a matter of blocked roads and damaged homes. But for one mystery that had lingered nearly 3 decades, the storm was something else entirely. When the skies finally cleared and the ground began to dry, hunters returning to the woods noticed the damage first. Trails they had walked for years were unrecognizable. Ravines that had once been hidden by dense brush were now cut open, their sides collapsed, roots dangling in the air. It was in one of these newly exposed gullies, miles from the nearest paved road, that two hunters came across something that made them stop in their tracks. Half buried in the mud, caught between broken tree roots, was the unmistakable outline of twisted metal. At first, they thought it was another old wreck, just like the dozens scattered in the region. But as they climbed closer, the shape became impossible to ignore. The frame of a vehicle jutted out of the hillside, its body rusted and crushed, but still whole enough to recognize as a station wagon. The hunters froze. The stories of the missing family had lingered in town for years, drifting between folklore and tragedy, and the moment they saw the dull green paint peeking through mud, the connection was immediate. They called authorities without hesitation, their voices steady but shaken. Within hours, county deputies and forensic teams were making their way down into the ravine, carefully navigating the unstable ground to reach the wreckage. The scene was haunting. The car had been swallowed by the earth decades earlier, entombed in layers of mud and forest growth, invisible to the searches that had scoured the area so many years before. Now, exposed by the storm's violence, it sat waiting, as if the land had finally been forced to give up its secret. Investigators approached it cautiously, documenting the position, noting the angle of the descent, and marking how the hillside's collapse had revealed it. The first photographs taken that day captured a chilling image. A family car lost to time, suddenly unearthed in a place no one had ever thought to look. News spread quickly. By the following morning, the discovery was on every local station, headlines reading, "Possible break in 27-year-old missing." Family case relatives who had grown old with unanswered questions were called, their voices breaking as they spoke of cautious hope. Some feared it would be another false lead, another wreck mistaken for the Millers. But for investigators, the details already lined up, the color, the make, the model. Everything pointed to the possibility that the decades of silence were about to end. Deputies set up a perimeter while specialized teams prepared to extract the vehicle. They worked slowly, knowing the earth around it was unstable and that any movement could collapse the hillside further. As crews secured the area, they reported seeing fragments already sliding free from the mud, shards of glass, scraps of fabric, a child's plastic toy warped by age. Each piece was bagged and tagged, handled with the care of evidence that could rewrite the entire story. For investigators who had once worked the case in the 90s, the phone calls carried a weight that was hard to describe. Retired officers admitted to sleepless nights, unable to believe that after 27 years of searching, the answer had been buried so close, hidden not by malice, but by geography. One described the moment he heard the news as, like a ghost walking into the room. By evening, the station wagon was confirmed to have been there for decades. The soil packed around it, the layers of root and stone, all pointed to a crash that had happened in the same year the Millers vanished. The car had likely plunged off the road during their final drive, disappearing into a ravine so steep and so overgrown that no search team ever stood a chance of finding it. Now, with the storm's erosion tearing open the earth, what had once been perfectly hidden was exposed in plain sight. The sheriff's office released a cautious statement, noting that while identification was still underway, they believed this was the breakthrough that had eluded them for decades. For the community, the news reignited both grief and relief. The mystery that had hung over them for so long seemed suddenly closer to resolution. But even as hope stirred, one chilling question remained unanswered. What would investigators find inside the car? The recovery of the vehicle began at dawn, with heavy equipment brought in to stabilize the hillside. For investigators, this wasn't just the extraction of a wreck, it was the reopening of a case that had weighed on the region for nearly 3 decades. Crews worked slowly, clearing mud and roots, cutting away the forest that had grown over the station wagon like a second skin. As the shape of the vehicle came into view, its rusted frame told the story of time passing in silence. The green paint was dulled to brown, its windows shattered, its roof collapsed inward. Yet it was unmistakably the Millers' car, preserved in the earth like a time capsule. When the doors were finally pried open, silence fell over the ravine. Inside the cabin, investigators found what they had both expected and dreaded. 4 skeletal remains were still in place, each strapped into a seatbelt. The family had not been scattered or hidden. They were all there, exactly where they had been the moment the car went off the road. Daniel was in the driver's seat, his bones slumped against the wheel. Karen sat in the passenger side, her remains tilted toward the door. In the back, the smaller skeletons of Emily and Josh remained buckled in, frozen in time as children, despite the decades that had passed. The interior of the car was a haunting preservation of that final day. A child's toy, a small plastic dinosaur, rested in the floorboard near the back seat. A road map, its ink faded and edges curled, was tucked into the side pocket of the passenger door. Snack wrappers crumbled to dust at the slightest touch, evidence of a family mid-journey when everything ended abruptly. Even the remnants of cassette tapes were found scattered across the seats, warped and brittle but unmistakably a relic of the late 90s. Forensic teams swarmed the site with a mix of determination and quiet reverence. They documented every detail, taking photographs and carefully tagging evidence. The car was lifted from its resting place inch by inch so as not to disturb the fragile remains. Soil samples were collected, debris cataloged. Every movement carried the weight of knowing this wasn't just evidence. It was the closure of lives cut short. The discovery struck investigators in a way few cases ever did. For younger officers, it was a chance to bring resolution to a story they had grown up hearing. For those who had worked the original Disappearance, it was the bittersweet end to decades of wondering. Retired deputies returned to the scene, some standing in silence, others shaking their heads at the realization that the family had been so close all along, hidden just beyond reach. The ravine had been steep, overgrown, and invisible from the road above. In 1998, it would have been impossible to see the car beneath the dense canopy. News coverage was relentless. The image of the station wagon, rusted and moss-covered, was broadcast nationwide. Headlines described it as a discovery that froze time. For the surviving relatives, the photographs were almost unbearable. Seeing the car again, seeing the outline of lives trapped inside, was like reopening a wound they had carried for years. Yet, beneath the grief was the faintest sense of relief. The uncertainty that had haunted them was finally shifting into an answer, however painful. As the car was removed from the ravine and transported to a secure facility for further analysis, the community gathered in quiet recognition of the moment. Candlelight vigils were held, where residents who had once searched for the family now stood together in mourning. The reality was stark. The Millers had not been abducted, nor had they staged their disappearance. They had been victims of a simple, tragic crash that no one had ever seen. For forensic specialists, the next step was to confirm identities through DNA, a process that would formally bring the family home. But even before the results, everyone knew the truth. The station wagon, the belongings, the position of the remains. There was no mistaking it. The unanswered question that had hovered for nearly 3 decades was finally facing resolution. Still, the discovery left behind a lingering unease. How had such a large search effort missed this spot? How had the forest been able to conceal the evidence so completely? Those questions hung in the air, not as accusations, but as reminders of the limits of human effort against nature's vastness. For the investigators on scene, one thought rose above all others. The truth had always been there, buried in the silence of the forest, waiting for time and chance to force it into the light. And as they prepared to analyze what the wreckage revealed about that final night, one thing became clear. The Millers' disappearance was no longer a story of speculation or rumor. It was the reality of a family frozen in place, only discovered when the forest could no longer hold its secret. The days following the recovery of the vehicle were spent in painstaking analysis. The rusted station wagon was transported to a secure facility where forensic teams began the process of carefully documenting its condition and examining the remains inside. It was delicate work. 27 years had passed and the elements had worn away much of what once was. Yet, even in their fragile state, the bones told a story. Dental records were pulled, DNA tests conducted, and within a matter of days, confirmation arrived. The remains belonged to Daniel, Karen, Emily, and Josh Miller. The missing family had finally been found. The medical examiner's reports were both detailed and sobering. Each of the four showed trauma consistent with a high-speed collision. Fractures to the skull, ribs, and long bones made clear that the impact had been violent. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no indication that anyone had survived beyond the crash itself. Forensic anthropologists determined that death would have been nearly instantaneous for at least 3 of the family members, with the 4th succumbing shortly after. It was a devastating conclusion, but one that fit the evidence. They had not been abducted or held captive. They had died the night they vanished. Investigators then turned to the vehicle itself to reconstruct what had happened. The front end was crumpled inward, consistent with having struck the base of the ravine at high speed. Soil patterns clinging to the undercarriage showed how the car had skidded before flipping nose first into the slope. When the hillside collapsed decades later, it had revealed the exact point where the car had come to rest. Tire marks, faint but still detectable in the preserved soil layers near the top of the ravine, confirmed that the car had veered suddenly off the road. Experts believed the crash had occurred at night, when visibility was low and fatigue could have played a role. The position of the remains offered further explanation. All 4 family members were still secured by their seatbelts. Daniel's skeleton leaned against the steering wheel, while Karen's was tilted against the passenger side door. The children's smaller frames remained buckled in the back. This detail, while heartbreaking, explained why no one had been able to escape. They had been restrained in a crash severe enough to leave them unconscious, and with the vehicle buried by foliage and soil, there had been no chance for rescue. Forensic engineers examined the car's mechanical condition. The age and wear on the tires were noted, as was a possible alignment issue in the steering mechanism. Combined with the narrow, unlit road and the dense brush concealing the ravine, the explanation became clear. The family had likely drifted off course, possibly due to fatigue or distraction, and plunged into terrain that completely erased them from sight. Search teams in 1998 had scoured the area, but the angle of the descent and the heavy foliage at the time had concealed the wreck so thoroughly that even helicopters had missed it. The truth, when assembled, was horrifying in its simplicity. The Millers had died within hours of leaving the diner. Their lives ended in an accident hidden by geography. For 27 years, while investigators chased theories of foul play and families endured endless speculation, their bodies had been entombed in the earth just a few hundred yards from the road. The intact seatbelts, the frozen positions of their bones, the mundane artifacts left behind, all of it painted a picture of an ordinary family cut down by an extraordinary misfortune. When authorities released these findings publicly, the impact was immediate. The announcement ended decades of rumors, but it also reopened old wounds. For some relatives, the knowledge that their loved ones had been so close, missed only by the cruel tricks of terrain, was almost harder to bear than the uncertainty. Others expressed relief that at last the questions were over. There would be no more speculation of debts, predators, or conspiracies. The truth, painful as it was, had finally surfaced. Yet, even with closure, investigators admitted to lingering regret. They acknowledged that in 1998, the technology and resources had not been enough to detect the hidden ravine, but the knowledge that the Millers had been there all along weighed heavily. It underscored the limitations of human search efforts against nature's capacity to conceal. The storm that exposed the car had succeeded where decades of manpower and equipment had failed. As the forensic work concluded, the remains of Daniel, Karen, Emily, and Josh were released to their surviving relatives. Plans for a long-delayed burial began, with the family finally able to rest together. But before the caskets were closed, the investigators who had worked tirelessly over the years took one last look at the case file. For them, It wasn't just about resolution. It was about the stark reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not born from evil, but from silence, circumstance, and the relentless grip of the natural world. When the news broke that the Miller family had been found, the reactions were overwhelming. For surviving relatives, the announcement collapsed 27 years of uncertainty into a moment of grief they had prepared for but never truly believed would come. They mourned not just the deaths, but the decades lost to waiting, birthdays that had passed without candles, graduations never attended, weddings and holidays spent with chairs left empty. Closure brought an end to questions, but it also deepened the sorrow, because now there was no hope left to cling to. Relief mingled with guilt. Family members admitted to having sometimes imagined that Daniel and Karen had run away, or that Emily and Josh might still be alive somewhere. Knowing they had been gone from the very beginning left survivors wrestling with feelings of shame for having doubted them, for having let rumors cloud their memories. Some spoke of the crushing realization that while they had lived with the torment of not knowing, the Millers' final moments had ended within hours of the road trip they were so excited to begin. Authorities addressed the community with honesty. The sheriff admitted the ravine where the car was discovered had fallen just outside the original search grids, a blind spot that doomed the investigation from the start. In 1998, searchers had scoured miles of terrain, but the steep drop concealed by thick brush had left the wreck invisible to every helicopter, every volunteer, every deputy who walked the roadside. The acknowledgement stung, not as negligence, but as a reminder of the limits of human effort against the immensity of nature. For the community, the revelation was haunting. The family had not vanished into a faraway place, nor been spirited off by strangers. They had been only miles from home all along. Every theory, every whispered rumor of abduction or foul play collapsed under the weight of that fact. What endured instead was a heavy silence, the realization that a tragedy so ordinary could still fracture a town for a generation. And as the Millers were finally laid to rest, the community braced itself for the last chapter of their story, how the forest, after nearly 3 decades, had been forced to surrender what it had taken. The discovery of the Miller family's car in 2025 did more than close a case. It rewrote the story that had defined an entire community for 27 years. For nearly 3 decades, people had filled the silence with theories: abduction, foul play, secret debts, a planned escape. But in the end, the truth was far simpler and far more devastating. It wasn't a predator on the highway, nor a conspiracy. It was the forest itself, swallowing a tragedy whole and keeping it hidden until nature decided to give it back. In the days that followed the forensic confirmation, residents found themselves grappling with the shock of how close the Millers had been all along. Less than a mile from the main road, just outside the original search grids, their station wagon had rested unseen. The revelation left many with a sense of unease, realizing that human eyes, helicopters, and dogs had all scoured the area but missed the one place that mattered most. The shocking discovery wasn't that the family had been murdered or taken. It was that the land had concealed them so thoroughly that they might never have been found without the storm's erosion. The case became a cautionary tale about the limits of human searching. Law enforcement admitted openly that even with resources, technology, and determination, some terrains are simply stronger than human persistence. A ravine hidden by brush, a slope too steep to access, a car painted green against the foliage. These were the factors that defeated years of searching. It was a humbling reminder that not every mystery is solved by skill or intent. Sometimes it is time and nature that decide when the truth will be revealed. For the relatives, the discovery brought an ending that was both merciful and cruel. They now knew what had happened, and they could lay the family to rest. But the knowledge that the Millers had been lost to an accident so near home left scars of a different kind. They grieved birthdays and milestones that had been lived in limbo. They spoke about Emily and Josh as though they had stayed children forever, never given the chance to grow. Closure did not erase the years of pain. It only marked the final line in a story that had weighed on them for half a lifetime. The community held a memorial that summer, 27 years after the disappearance. Residents who had searched the woods back in 1998 stood side by side with a younger generation that had only heard the case as legend. Candles were lit and names were read aloud, honoring not just the family, but the relentless endurance of those who had carried their memory through decades of uncertainty. At the service, people admitted the hardest truth of all, that the mystery had been solved not by detectives or investigators, but by the violent force of a storm that tore open the land and revealed what human hands could not. In the years that followed, the Miller case remained a point of reflection. Documentaries and articles dissected how such a disappearance could go unsolved for so long. Experts spoke of the search gap, those blind spots that exist even in the most thorough operations, where terrain and chance conspire to keep evidence hidden. The Miller's story became an example taught in search and rescue training, a warning that even when everything possible is done, there may still be places that lie beyond human reach. What endured most was the haunting simplicity of it all. For 27 years, the mystery had spiraled outward, pulling in theories of predators and conspiracies, leaving a community in endless debate. And yet, the truth was that a family of 4 had died within hours of vanishing, their car tumbling unseen into a ravine, their voices silenced not by malice, but by the blind indifference of the wilderness. The shocking part wasn't the darkness of human intent, it was how ordinary tragedy could masquerade as mystery when buried under layers of earth and time. For the first time since that June day in 1998, the Miller story had an ending. The family was buried together, their headstones lined in a row, a physical place for relatives to visit after decades of absence. Flowers replaced unanswered questions. The silence, while heavy, was no longer empty. The forest had finally surrendered its secret, and with it, the town that had carried the weight of the unknown could begin, slowly, to let go.